It begins in the winter of 1991. Moscow is gray and silent. The snow falls over Red Square as the Soviet flag, red with its golden hammer and sickle, flutters for the last time above the Kremlin. Below, citizens line up in the freezing cold, not for revolution, but for bread. Shelves are empty. Rubles are worthless. The mighty Soviet Union, once feared, admired, and envied, is dissolving not from war or invasion, but from something more subtle and devastating, an economic collapse born from within. How could a superpower that built cities, launched rockets, and ruled half the planet collapse under the weight of its own system? Why did the command economy, designed to eliminate crisis, create one so vast it ended an empire? To understand this fall, we must go back to the beginning, to an idea. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they promised not just equality, but efficiency. The market, they argued, was chaos. Prices, profits, and competition were tools of exploitation. The new Soviet model would replace them with rational planning. The state would own everything: land, factories, railways, and distribute goods according to need, not greed. In theory, it was perfect. No waste, no unemployment, no recessions. In practice, it replaced millions of independent decisions with one gigantic bureaucracy. By the 1920s, under Lenin's new economic policy, the Soviet economy briefly flirted with limited capitalism. Peasants could trade, small businesses reopened. But after Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin ended that experiment. In 1928, the first five-year plan began, aiming to transform a rural nation into an industrial giant overnight. The results were staggering. Coal, steel, and oil output exploded. Entire cities like Magnitogorsk and Norilsk appeared in barren lands. The USSR went from an agricultural backwater to the world's second-largest industrial power in just a generation. But behind this miracle lay coercion and imbalance. The state poured resources into heavy industry and defense while starving consumer goods and agriculture. People produced more iron than anyone could use, but had no shoes, no meat, no freedom to choose. The Soviet economy grew, but in the wrong direction. Success was measured not by value, but by volume. If a factory was told to produce 10,000 nails, it made them tiny to meet the quota. If ordered by weight, it made them enormous and useless. Statistics became theater, not truth. Local managers faked numbers to satisfy central planners. Overproduction and shortages coexisted absurdly. Warehouses overflowed with unsold parts. Yet no complete machines could be built. By the 1950s, this inefficiency was hidden behind impressive figures: 5% annual growth, huge industrial projects, atomic power. But the deeper the system grew, the less it adapted. When Nikita Khrushchev took power after Stalin's death, he saw the cracks. He tried to decentralize control, creating regional economic councils and boosting agriculture with massive investments, the Virgin Lands campaign. For a moment, optimism returned. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite, in 1957, and beat America into space with Yuri Gagarin in 1961. To the world, socialism looked unstoppable. But while rockets soared, harvests failed. Poor planning, soil exhaustion, and corruption ate away the results. Khrushchev's reforms were half measures, still command-driven, still unable to fix incentives. In 1964, he was removed by his own party, replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who promised stability and delivered stagnation. The Brezhnev era, from 1964 to 1982, was the peak and the beginning of decline. Oil prices boomed in the 1970s, flooding the USSR with petrodollars. For a while, the Soviet economy looked prosperous again. The state expanded social programs, subsidized food and housing, and imported grain from the West to feed its population. But instead of reforming, it coasted. Oil masked inefficiency. Soviet factories still produced outdated machines, productivity lagged far behind the West, and the bureaucracy thickened. Central planners numbered in the millions. Decisions that took days in a market took years in Moscow's ministries. Every problem was solved with another plan, another quota, another decree. Meanwhile, the West was transforming. Computers, microchips, and flexible production systems were reshaping capitalism. The Soviet Union, bound by rigid planning, couldn't compete in this new technological race. Information moved too slowly. Prices, supposed to be the language of economics, were frozen by ideology. A pair of shoes might cost the same whether it was beautiful or unwearable. Without feedback, there was no innovation. Without profit, no motivation. The Soviet economy was like a giant machine running without oil, still turning, but grinding itself to dust. By the early 1980s, decline was undeniable. Economic growth had fallen close to zero. Grain imports soared. The population's standard of living stagnated. Shops stood half empty, while corruption and black markets filled the gaps. The government spent enormous sums on the military to keep pace with the United States in the Cold War, draining resources from everything else. The USSR had become what economists called a military-industrial state, bristling with weapons but poor in goods. The Afghan War, launched in 1979, bled the economy further. By the time Brezhnev died in 1982, the Soviet system was exhausted, its leaders old and cynical. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev. When he rose to power in 1985, he was only 54, young by Soviet standards, and determined to save socialism. His program, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, aimed to modernize the economy by introducing limited market reforms and political transparency. He reduced censorship, encouraged debate, and allowed state enterprises to make some independent decisions. For a moment, it seemed as though the USSR might reinvent itself. But perestroika faced a paradox. To work, it needed freedom. But freedom exposed the system's failures. Once people could speak honestly, they stopped pretending the plan worked. The truth came flooding out. Inflation, waste, shortages, corruption. The illusion shattered. Factories no longer obeyed orders, but there were no real markets to replace the command system. Prices were still fixed, distribution broke down, and shortages turned catastrophic. In 1990, food rationing returned. Rubles piled up with nothing to buy. The black market became the only functioning economy. Meanwhile, the republics that made up the Soviet Union, Ukraine, the Baltics, Central Asia, began to demand independence. The state, unable to pay its bills or control its people, started to unravel. Gorbachev's reforms, meant to save socialism, instead revealed that it could not be saved. By 1991, the USSR was bankrupt in every sense. Oil prices had collapsed, revenues had evaporated, and debt mounted. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned. The next day, the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. But the story did not end with the flag. The collapse of the Soviet economy was not a failure of people. It was a failure of design. The planned system could mobilize resources, win wars, and build industries, but it could not adapt, innovate, or respond to human needs. When scarcity met bureaucracy, truth died first. then efficiency, then faith. The Soviet experiment tried to replace markets with mathematics, but forgot that economies are not machines. They are living systems built on information, trust, and incentive. 3 lessons remain. First, no amount of planning can replace the corrective power of reality. When prices lie, everything built upon them lies too. Second, prosperity without feedback breeds decay. A system that fears criticism guarantees its own blindness. And third, any ideology that values control over adaptability will eventually collapse, because the world changes faster than commands can be written. The Soviet Union fell not from invasion or conspiracy, but from the weight of its own contradictions. It proved that power can conquer territory, but not inefficiency, that a command can move armies, but not ideas, and that no empire, however vast, can survive when its system outruns reality. If this story made you see history differently, subscribe to Economic Collapse. Because behind every empire's fall lies the same question: how long can we ignore the limits of what we control before they remind us who's really in charge?